although he has perhaps the widest and most varied interests in life of any man we are likely to know, and this is true, I still think that his great passion was the political life, and that he brought to the service of it a most complete vision.
I was with him all the time when he was trying to prevent a war, but I couldn't help the feeling that at heart he loved war. He enjoyed the excitement and the enterprise and the making of decisions.
The voices of Lord Avon, formerly Sir Anthony Eden, recalling the tribute he paid Sir Winston Churchill when he succeeded him as Prime Minister in 1955, and of Lord Boothby, who has been both Parliamentary Private Secretary to Churchill and Minister in his government. Well, millions of words have been written about Winston Churchill, but in this programme we are attempting a sound portrait, assembled by some of the people who knew him well, covering many aspects of this remarkable man's activities as a politician, a war leader, an artist, a writer, a friend. Let's begin by hearing again from Lord Avon, who worked more closely than anyone with Churchill, particularly when he was Foreign Secretary in Sir Winston's government.
Of course, the tradition that's been built up, that Winston was a man who must have his own way all the time, is really not a fair tradition. He liked to discuss matters and argue matters. And many a time when we worked on a draft or a dispatch or something, or even a draft of speech, he would comment, 2 heads are better than 1. Of course, that didn't mean that you didn't occasionally have arguments and sometimes even rows. But you know, Winston hadn't much use for a yes man. And if he thought what you were doing was to try and produce the answer that he wanted, he would soon become mistrustful of any tactic of that sort. And so we actually, on foreign affairs, we, in those years, virtually had no serious differences at all. In fact, I think it was Winston himself, but I can't establish this, who said on some occasion that you could put each of us in a separate room and put any questions on foreign policy to us, and 9 times out of 10 we'd give the same answer. I liked working with Winston very much, indeed, and I had an immense admiration for him, particularly when times were most difficult. Looking back on the events of the war years, it's easy to picture them as a period when the defeat of the Nazi tyranny, of Japanese militarism, and the fascist duplicity was always inevitable. And in fact, it wasn't. It was nothing of the kind. And for those of us who lived through that period, beside Churchill, there were dark days, and months, and years, when confidence in ultimate victory rested on instinctive faith rather than on material means. And it was in times like that that Winston was so splendid. And there's one other thing that perhaps I might mention about Winston among his qualities. Watching him in government, he never would accept easily a technical opinion. He liked to probe it, to examine it, to question it. Now that's quite an important gift in a prime minister or a leading minister, because too often I've seen in the past examples where the technical argument has perhaps floored the statesman too quickly, and he hasn't probed it, he's accepted it, and maybe he's taken the wrong turning. And that was another of Winston's gifts, to sift, to probe, to cross-examine, and of course, if you made out a good case whoever for it, then he would accept that case, probably. But he wouldn't accept it until he'd satisfied himself that it really was a good case and stood up to examination. He was tolerant, of course, in the sense that he could, for instance, he could argue against you with an argument, and you might even have a row about it. And a day or two later, you might, to your surprise, find him using the same argument himself, which was part of the humour and humanity of the man.
One thing which strikes me there is the rather defensive note in Lord Avon's voice when he said, "I liked working with Churchill." Lord Boothby is rather more definite. He was, he said,
at times absolutely charming, and at times pretty rough. When he was First Lord of the Admiralty, came back to power, and Prime Minister, he either sacked or tried to sack every single commander, admiral commander afloat, the lot, including Cunningham, whom he accused of cowardice, and Cunningham was holding the Mediterranean with a skeleton force against the whole of the Italian Navy and massive German reinforcements. He took his decisions on the whole on his own. I think there's no doubt about that. He would talk endlessly. In the bath, I had many conversations with him when he was in the bath. And then he would say to me, "Go and take down what I've said." And then he would turn a sort of porpoise circle in the bath and sink underneath it and to come up the other end. And it was very funny.
The bath seems to have figured prominently in Sir Winston's life. As Lady Nancy Astor discovered, she was the first woman to be elected to Parliament.
Winston Churchill, who I knew quite well, like many other members of the House, and who I knew intimately, simply could not bring themselves to speak to me once I was in the House. But after about 2 years, I met Winston at dinner, and he congratulated me on my performance. I asked him why he'd not spoken to me before, and he replied, "We thought that if we could freeze you out, we would get rid of the lot." "Why," asked I, "did you want to get rid of the lot?" "Well," replied Winston, "when you entered the House of Commons, I felt as though some woman had entered my bath, and I'd nothing to protect myself with except my sponge."
Well, returning to this point about what Churchill was like to work with, William Deakin, the former warden of St. Antony's College at Oxford and a hero of the Yugoslav partisan movement in the last war, worked closely with Churchill on a number of his books, such as his Life of his ancestor, the Duke of Marlborough, and his History of the English-speaking Peoples.
He would dictate to secretaries late at night, particularly in the 30s when we were working the most closely together. I suppose it was between 1935 and 1939. And our hours of work would be usually from 10 in the evening till 4 in the morning. And this is when the work would be done. It would be dictated. The next morning he would then work with a red pencil on proofs, and he would correct. He was very exacting. He expected one to be on his level. The result was, I think I can summarize it in one sentence. He made you feel better than you were.
This pattern of nighttime working is vividly illustrated by Admiral of the Fleet Earl Mountbatten of Burma, a cousin of the Queen, who in 1942 was Chief of Combined Operations and a member of the British Chiefs of Staff Committee.
The routine we used to have at Chequers, the official country residence of the Prime Minister, was extraordinary. Churchill went there every weekend, and he would then send for the chiefs of staff or other people. About 5:30 or 6 would come the message, "The Prime Minister wants you to come to Chequers for the night." I had a board with 6 bell pushers on it. I used to turn it over, press on it, and bells rang on every floor in my headquarters. People used to run up and down saying, "Chequers, Chequers, Chequers," and everybody came with all the files and papers dealing with every operation, every plan we had on hand. I filled a large suitcase with these and went down to Chequers, not knowing what he wanted to talk about, but wishing to have all my facts with me. One used to drive down in the blackout and arrive at Chequers at about 8 o'clock to join the party, which might include other chiefs of staff or ministers or visitors and Lady Churchill and one of his daughters. At 8:30 p.m. the company assembled for drinks, and then at about 9 we went into dinner, and a very good dinner it used to be. It went on for a long while, and then at about 10:15 the ladies left the room, and Winston held forth over brandy and a good cigar. It was most entertaining and amusing. At about 10:40 or so we'd get up and join the ladies. We all went up and saw a film. He had a cinema projector at Chequers and always had a film over the weekends. When the film was over, which would be perhaps about 12:30 a.m., we had a nightcap with the ladies, and at about 1 o'clock in the morning we'd start work, going through all the things we wanted to discuss, until 2, 3, or 3:30 a.m. On one occasion, General Marshall, the Chief of the United States Army, was in the party. We went through this process, and at 12:30, when the ladies went to bed, he got up to go. We all said, "You can't go now, it hasn't started yet." But Churchill was beaten at this game once, the only time I have ever seen him defeated. General Smuts, his great South African friend, was among the party. And at about 1 o'clock, Winston said, "Well, now we will start work." "No," said Smuts, "I am not going to start work. I am not going to be a party to your murdering the British Chiefs of Staff. Here they are. They have to be back in the office by 9 o'clock in the morning, ready for meetings at 9:30. You will still be lying in bed with a fat cigar dictating to your secretary. They have to work all the morning and all the afternoon, and in the afternoon you have a siesta. You bring them down here and make them work all night as well. You will kill them, and I'm not going to be a party to that." He then got up and went to bed. There was absolute silence for a minute or two. Nobody spoke. Suddenly, Winston got up and said, "Well, perhaps we'd better go to bed." It was the only time we were let off.
Another aspect of Churchill's character mentioned just now by Lord Avon, and which indeed was referred to by every single one of the many people I've talked to who knew him well, was his bulldog quality, his tenacity, his determination. Lord Mountbatten again.
In May 1941, I was sunk in the Kelly, that is the destroyer leader which I was in command, and I was then sent to take over command of a new ship, the aircraft carrier Illustrious, which was being repaired in America. While I was at Pearl Harbor visiting the American Pacific Fleet, I got a telegram from Churchill relieving me of my command and recalling me to England. I was very upset. The last thing I wanted to do was to leave the war at sea and sit in Whitehall. When I got back, I reported to him. He said, "Why have you taken so long to answer my summons?" I replied rather light-heartedly, "Well, sir, I was very nearly on the 180th meridian, and I wasn't sure which way around the world you wanted me to come back." He quelled me with a look. "You know why you've come? I want you to relieve Admiral Keyes, in charge of combined operations." Now, Admiral Keyes had been the Commander-in-Chief of the Mediterranean Fleet when I was a lieutenant on his staff, and now I was to take over from him. "What have you got to say to that?" I said, "Sir, I would sooner be back at sea, fighting with my friends, rather than sitting on my backside in Whitehall." "Have you no sense of glory?" Churchill retorted. "I offer you a chance to take part in the highest direction of the war, and all you want to do is to go back to sea. What could you hope to achieve, except to be sunk in a bigger and more expensive ship this time?" He then went on. "You will carry on with the commando raids on the occupied coast of Europe, not only to keep up our morale and to worry the Germans, but because I want you to learn the technique of opposed landings. For you are to prepare for the invasion of Europe. We cannot win this war unless we land an army in France and defeat Hitler on land. You must arrange to collect soldiers, sailors, and airmen, put them in training bases, teach them to operate as one force. You must devise the new techniques, you must design new landing craft and new landing ships, the appurtenances and the appliances necessary for invasion. The whole of the south of England is a bastion of defense against Hitler's invasion. You must turn that into a springboard for our own attack. Every other headquarters in England is thinking defensively. Yours is to think only offensively." Now that was said on the 22nd of October 1941, after Hitler had overrun Europe. Practically every country was occupied.
The universality of Churchill was the element that struck William Deakin most, who started working with him in 1935.
At that time, of course, as you know, he was in opposition and mainly living in Churchill, not in London. He was halfway through his life of Marlborough. And that was the reason why I was brought in to help him with the research to finish, in fact, there are 2 volumes that completed the whole set. Then it went on. In fact, apart from the gap of the war, of the 7 years of war, I worked with him as his, in fact, literary secretary from 1935 to 39. And after he finished Marlborough, he started on the history of the English-speaking peoples. And we worked on that. And perhaps to give you, if I may, an idea of what his approach to history was, I think perhaps the most important thing to say is that he was not an historian in a separate compartment. It was part of his life. And he didn't distinguish between the past and the present. He had identified himself with the past, and he lived in the present, but there was a continuity. And he was not an historian or a politician or a statesman or an artist. He was a man, and a universal man. This is the first and strongest impression I think I would like to try and convey, if I may. And it's the universality of the man, which of course is overwhelming. I must make a confession at once. I myself surrendered unconditionally from the moment, really, of meeting him, and that surrender remained, for me anyway, throughout our relationship. As regards what happened after that, in terms of his books, like many thousands of other people, I was away during the war. And when I came back to England in 1946, I went back to the university, and then he asked me to help him with his war memoirs, with the Second World War. And I worked with him on that, doing the diplomatic and the political side, working largely on his own papers and on government documents for another 3 years. So that is really the extent of my relationship with him as his literary secretary. But to give you an idea of what you might call the thread of history, if I may, you remind me of something. And that is that at the outbreak of war, he was then summoned to the Admiralty as First Lord. I was a young territorial officer and was summoned to my regiment. We got as far as the Norman Conquest in his History of the English-speaking Peoples. And one day, my adjutant received a message asking me to report to the Admiralty, in fact, ordering me to report to the Admiralty, which I did. And this was at the time of the Norwegian campaign. And I was ushered into the First Lord's room, and there on the wall was the operational map of the British fleet off the coast of Norway. After a few words, Sir Winston said to me, at 10 o'clock tonight we're going to start work. Having dispatched the business of the First Lord of the Admiralty, at 10 o'clock in the evening we started on the Norman Conquest. Now that to him was logical, absolutely logical. That was to him history.
I asked William Deakin about Churchill's style as a writer.
The style is that of an orator, and one has to remember, perhaps it's not known to everybody, that in a sense he never wrote a word in writing it down on paper with a pen. His works are dictated, and therefore it is a speaker putting down his thoughts. And therefore it has a certain style of oratory. I don't think one can say that there are any models. He read very widely. He had a superb and limitless historical imagination. He could assimilate exactly an atmosphere and a climate of a completely different world. For instance, the 17th century and Marlborough. He didn't identify himself with the past, but he felt a connection with the past. It's something, two quite separate things. And I think the style comes from the fact that he spoke. I'd never ever seen him write a line. And the style emerged, I wouldn't say exactly that of an orator. He was deeply read in I suppose if he was asked himself this question, he wouldn't answer it quite, I'm sure he wouldn't answer it as I would try to answer it. But certainly it is in the great tradition of English political oratory. And not any political oratory, also in the tradition of English historians. And clearly Gibbon had a great influence on him, for one. And his style is built up, I think it would be correct to say, during his period as a young subaltern in India. It is reading in India, Macaulay, Gibbon, the books that he read that he hadn't a chance to read before as a young man at Harrow, or as a subaltern, when he had the leisure, the creation of his style is really created during leisure hours in the Indian Army.
Sir Winston did put pen to paper occasionally, however. His grandson, also Winston Churchill, also now a Member of Parliament, remembers his early years.
My grandfather was always around. I didn't see that much of him, except in the distance in those days, but later on, when he was out of office and when I was at school, we would correspond. I'm ashamed to say that I didn't write more often than I did, because he would always write back to me. He always found time to do that. And wonderfully amusing letters, little nibblings around the bottom of the letter, and he'd write in his own hand, P.S. You will see from the nibblings that Toby, who was his pet budgerigar, wishes to be remembered.
But the universality of Sir Winston did not extend to the world of music, as I discovered in my conversation with his grandson.
Well, in the sort of received view of things, he was wholly non-musical in that the classics meant nothing to him, as indeed they mean nothing to many members of my family. But he loved popular songs, and he would frequently, so after the brandy, sort of strike up one of his sort of favourite ditties.
He would sing himself, or did he play the piano?
No, he never played the piano. He never had any great musical talents that I ever knew of, but he would sing himself, yes.
What sort of songs?
If you could call it singing.
Yes. Can you remember? I mean, sort of keep the home fires burning, or...
oh, no. Well, he loved those sort of things when it was sort of sung en masse.
Yes.
And he would join in fortissimo. So over lunch, it would be, I've got a little cat, and I'm very fond of that, but I'd rather have a bow-wow-wow.
Daddy wouldn't buy me a bow-wow. Daddy wouldn't buy me a bow-wow. I've got a little cat, and I'm very fond of that, but I'd rather have a bow-wow-wow.
Well, Churchill may not have been musical, but he was an artist. When he was very young, acting as a war correspondent in the Boer War in South Africa, he used to supplement his written dispatches with sketches drawn in the field and sent home to be worked up as illustrations for his newspaper. Later in life, he started to paint in earnest, putting into practice his creed that audacity is a very great part of the art of painting. Churchill was not a great painter by any means. He viewed his work as a hobby. One man who knew him very well in his role as an artist is Paul Mars, who was born in Normandy and later took British nationality. He is himself a painter of distinction, and almost the last surviving link with the great Impressionists. He had a studio in Paris with Derain on one side and Ségonzac on the other. He knew Vuillard and Georges Braque. He met Churchill in the First World War, and they were very close friends, as Paul Mars says, up to the last.
He started really painting seriously when, between the wars, he was out of office. And I don't think people realize how lonely he was. And thanks to his writing and painting, it was they were solace in which he could put the whole of his energy. Do you see? I've seen him sometimes depressed, but only for a short time, because there was always that vision which always recreated the man that you knew so well, with that energy and that vision, we used to paint next to each other. I'll put it this way. I have no pretension of having taught anybody anything, least of all Winston how to paint. But we used to discuss painting, of course, and sometime he would say, "My God, look, I'm in a mess." And I used to say to him, "My dear Winston, the old fault, you're committing your forces far too quickly." And that's where really it's rather the mark of really an artist, is that he had the picture painted in a way before he started. But of course, he hadn't always the means to finish them, which of course requires a whole life of experience. Later, he met a lot of French painters, which I was so pleased to introduce him to, and he loved them. And of course, all these conversations, they begin building up unconsciously progress. I am now, at my age, 87, I'm learning every day. I always used to impress upon him that he mustn't listen to Dick, Tom and Harry, who knew better. Do you see? And he was to paint as he loved painting, but approach it with a little, I won't say reverence, but with less energy. Like a true artist that he was, because I call him an artist, everything interested Winston. And that's why he was such a good soldier. That's why he was such a good administrator. Winston could do anything, even lay bricks, with great passion. It was like a ritual when he used to put the mortar on where he was going to place his brick. One had the impression that, like Samindu, you know, there was a spirit behind it, and he used to clean his brick and look at it, and like a child he saw the result of a few more bricks gradually making the wall higher and higher, you see. And he was delighted and would turn around and light another cigar, you know, and life was marvellous.
Paul Mars. Well, Churchill built a wall and helped to build a swimming pool at Chartwell, his country home in the south of England. A former sergeant major in the army, Harry Whitbread, was his tutor in the art of bricklaying, and he says he had tiny hands and he used to wear 2 pairs of gloves. I remember once he was driving a nail into a brick and the head came through the finger of the gloves, pinning them to the wall. He said, "Tiggy, that's my nickname, look what I've done. How will I get it off?" "Take your hand out of the glove," I told him. He laughed and said, "I'm a ruddy fool." Well, Paul Mars also made the point that Churchill's American connections were of very considerable importance to this country as a whole.
He was really always, from very early on, in touch with America through his American mother. And right through in his character, you could see those influences, and I quickly add, which were excellent. Now, in the Second War, when really Winston Churchill, who came into power by, if I may say so, miracles, because up till the declaration of war, and for some time even after, Winston was out of office, and he was the man who had tried to open the eyes of the government of the day of the dangers that we were facing. And thank God, through Winston being able, without any diffidence, he was able to ring up his friends in America and keep them in touch with the situation.
Well, what was he like to be with as a man, as a friend?
Nobody could be easier than Winston. Absolutely, everything he did was based on genuine human reaction. Winston was incapable of insincerity. And he had also a great quality, was his everlasting gratitude for whatever had come to him, one way or the other. Towards the interest of the aim that he had at the time, and so on. Because people are so apt to forget. He never forgot.
Nor does Lord Avon forget the many occasions when he was with Sir Winston in what might be called an unofficial capacity.
We often had meals together, often I stayed at Churchill, and so I knew we talked of all sorts of things apart from the actual day-to-day work. In fact, I can give you one example of that which occurred to me the other day. Must have been in the very dark days of 1940, and I was dining, we were dining alone, and after talking about our immediate problems, we then came to discuss what was the period in history in which each of us would most have liked to have lived. Winston, as you can guess, opted for the Queen Anne period, Marlborough, and the rest of that. And I favoured the Pitt era against Napoleon. We both paid tribute to the first Elizabeth reign. And after we talked for a while like this, Winston suddenly turned to me and said, "But of course, the greatest period of all is this." And that, mark you, was at the time when our fortunes were about at their nadir. Well, of course, he was the man of the hour, wasn't it? The man of that hour. It doesn't so often happen in history that the man and the hour coincide as they did in Winston's case. He expressed the country's feelings, sentiments. He will be the last to say that they depended on him alone. Of course, that would not be true, but he was their interpreter and their expression.
Lord Boothby would agree on that point at least.
What he did was to save us in 1940. I think he saved the Western world and Western civilization in 1940, and almost single-handed. And I think that he deserved to be immortalized for that. But as I said, there was a streak of brutality in his nature. He behaved very roughly to many commanders and to many ministers. The ministers in his government, of whom I was once one myself, were frightened of him. They were frightened of the sack. Winston Churchill was never very much liked by anybody. And that's the truth. He was the great hero in 1940, but he was never liked. He had very few friends. I know of no man, apart from Birkenhead, who was a true friend of Winston Churchill.
And the Earl of Birkenhead, a famous lawyer and a Lord Chancellor of England, had a very rough edge to his tongue. It was not surprising, I suppose, that eventually there came the parting of the ways between Sir Winston and Lord Boothby.
I wrote him a letter in which I told him how to run the war in 1940, just after the fall of France. And I said, you must do this, you must do that, you must do the other thing. And you must send all the members of Parliament back to their constituencies to rally the forces in the country. And he sent for me, and he went through that letter, scorching it, sentence by sentence. And finally he said, there's nothing in what you say. Go away. And I went away, and I drank a quadruple whiskey in the House of Commons. And that was really the breach in our relationship. Later on, he took me up again. He wanted me very badly for the debate on the Tobruk evacuation, when there was a vote of censure on the government. And he asked me to lunch. I came up from my Air Force station, and I lunched with him in the House of Commons. And he said, are you on my side? And I said, yes, because there's no other side to be on. And he said, are you prepared to speak in this debate? And I said, yes, I am. I've prepared a speech. And he took me himself to the Speaker of the House of Commons and said, I want you to call Mr. Boothby fourth on the list of speakers in this debate. And the Speaker said, I will. And I made not one of my worst speeches. And I turned the course of the debate in favor of Churchill, who was very anxious about the outcome. And afterwards, he took me to the smoking room of the House of Commons and stood me a whiskey and drank to the Pegasus wings of my oratory. And then I never heard from him again for 2 years, when we had a row about de Gaulle, because I was with the Free French, and I wanted de Gaulle to go to France after the invasion. He hadn't been told about the invasion. And I said, why don't you let de Gaulle go to France? And he came down to the House of Commons in a towering rage. He was so angry with me that I thought he was going to strike me.
That was the final breakdown in their relationship. But going back for a moment to this question of Sir Winston's friends, Lord Mountbatten, I think, would not agree with Lord Boothby, although they would perhaps also disagree in their definition of friendship.
In retrospect, it's really rather extraordinary to think we were such good friends. After all, there was more than a quarter of a century apart in ages, and yet one never felt that in talking to him. One felt one was talking to somebody who was equal in age, and was boss politically, but a man who was prepared to listen to what one had to say, and it was great fun being with him. This friendship lasted a very long while. I think that I was one of the last people to go and have luncheon with him before he died. There was only one period of absolute estrangement. When I came back from India in 1948, he disapproved very much of the part I had played in giving independence to India. In fact, he didn't speak to me for about 5 years. The first time he spoke to me again was a moving occasion for me, because he had made my father First Sea Lord in 1912, and now he offered me the job of First Sea Lord in 1955.
Earl Mountbatten was the last Viceroy of India and presided over the British withdrawal, a policy that, as you heard just now, Churchill fiercely opposed. Well, Finally, there are innumerable stories about this extraordinary man, stories that have achieved the dimension of legends. Lord Avon.
Of course, the stories of him about him are legion, and they are not all exactly truthful, but they are very good ones around. I can give you one, which is a true one. Really, I promise a true one. We had been arguing with the Turks in Cairo, trying to get them to cooperate more in the war, and we hadn't succeeded. Most of the brunt of the argument had fallen on me, and I had failed to shift them. The day came to say goodbye. Winston said, we'll drive to the airport to see the President off, which we did with his Foreign Secretary. And we drove out, and just as the President was stepping in the aeroplane, he turned round and embraced Winston. When we got back into the car, Winston said to me, do you see what happened then? Eh? The Turkish President kissed me. I was feeling slightly sour, I suppose, after learning about our failures, and I said, if that's the only result we get of our 3 days' effort, I'm not quite sure it was worth it. Or some words to that effect. Winston didn't say a thing. That night, when he was being tucked up in bed by his daughter, Sarah, he said to her, do you know what happened to me today, Sarah? The Turkish President kissed me. The truth is I'm irresistible. But don't tell Anthony, he's jealous.
And the last word from Sir Winston's grandson.
As a boy at Eton and later at Oxford, I would frequently lunch with him at Hyde Park Gate, and he would say, now let us go to the House of Commons, and bundle into the car, and driver Bullock would sort of come to a halt at the first red lights opposite the Victoria and Albert Memorial, and there'd be a bellow, what are we waiting for? Let us proceed. And Bullock would say, well, the red lights. Oh, do not let that delay a member of Parliament on his way about his business. And it was there that I got my first taste of the House of Commons. He would put me in the box underneath the gallery, and he was very religious about going for question time. Then later on, at the age of 21 or so, I was just leaving university. I'd learned to fly a single-engine plane. I was planning to fly with a friend to 40 countries in the Middle East and Africa, with only less than 250 flying hours between the two of us. And I went to have lunch at Hyde Park Gate to tell my grandfather this, and he shook his head very gravely. And I think that's a very hazardous enterprise. And I said, well, that comes very well from you. By my age, you'd already seen active service in Cuba on the northwest frontier of India. You'd charged with the 21st Lancers d'Armes, and you were on the point of being captured by the Boers. I really don't think it comes well from you to say that this is a hazardous enterprise. So at that he backed down and wished us a safe journey.
Some men, Shakespeare wrote, are born great, some achieve greatness, and some have greatness thrust upon them. All three aspects of greatness are true of Sir Winston Churchill to a certain extent, in particular the last. He was the man of the hour, thrown up by the irresistible wave of circumstance to the highest pinnacle of fame and achievement. This could also be said of Napoleon, whom Churchill most admired, and Hitler, whom he most detested. How much was he a product of his time, or would he have been great at any point in history? All we can say with any certainty is that his name will last as long as history itself.